Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to another inspiring session of Modulis Talks. I'm Sophie, your host for today's webinar. For those of you who are new to our sessions, Modulis brings together design industry experts to share knowledge and ideas, both in person at our showrooms across Europe and online. Today, we're kicking off a new series of Modulis Talks embracing neuro-inclusive design. You'll gain insights into how your creative design can make a difference for all individuals. Our presenter for this session is Jess Meredith, founder of Differing Minds. Jess will dive into neuro-centered design processes and explains what changes can be implemented to support neurodivergent individuals. So let's dive in and hear from Jess.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's really great to be here to talk about something that I am incredibly passionate about. And just to add on to what Sophie said, so as she said, my name is Jess, my pronouns are she, her, and I do a lot of work in the neurodiversity space. I work with workplaces, I work with schools, I work with universities, anywhere really that will have me to talk about how we can improve the access to opportunities and just generally to society for neurodivergent people. And I care really passionately about this because it impacts my family very personally. So I have ADHD. I have a little girl who is autistic with some other differences as well. And so I feel very passionate about sharing this amazing world of understanding more about the different ways in which we think with everybody. And I think understanding it from the perspective of design, the built environment, is so important because it enables people to access so much when we start to consider their needs in this context. So in terms of what I'm going to cover, I'm going to talk a little bit about what neurodiversity is, sort of the fundamentals. Some of this you may be familiar with, it may be new to you, but I just want to make sure everyone has that core understanding of what we're talking about in that context, and some of the terms as well that I'll use throughout the presentation. Then I'll go on to look at the impact of built environments for neurodivergent people, and we'll talk about kind of some of the things to consider when you are designing and building these spaces. And then we'll look at how to design for neuro-inclusion. So some kind of core design principles that will really help frame your work and make sure that you are taking into account the needs of everybody from the outset. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So first of all, what is neurodiversity? So neurodiversity essentially says that all of our brains are different. All of our brains are unique. So we all exist within the concept of neurodiversity. There's a little bit of a misconception that somebody has neurodiversity or it impacts some people, but actually neurodiversity as a phrase says it's the diversity of our brains, of our cognitive profiles and of our neurotypes. So it encompasses everybody. Now, the neurodiversity movement is a movement that wants us to get to a point where we no longer see what a lot of people see or subconsciously think as a normal brain type and then a sort of not so normal brain type, or the right way of thinking, doing things, perceiving the world, and the wrong way. What we want to get to is a place where we actually value, accept, and embrace everybody, regardless of their brain type, regardless of the way that they think. But we aren't quite there yet. We are quite a far way off actually being there in terms of our broader societies. So it's useful to categorize people. I mean, we love categories. So it's useful to categorize people into what we would call the neuromajority. So the people that fit into the majority of brain types. So that would be people who see the world, experience the world in reasonably similar ways. They might have differences, we're all different, but mostly their brains operate in the same way. And then the other side of this, the other category is the neurominority. So most people, or a lot of people, would call these people neurodivergent people. That's the term that I choose to use, but you might also hear them described as neurodiverse, neuroatypical in the neurominority, or neurospicy is a term that is gaining popularity amongst the community at the moment. But regardless of what term people prefer, those people are people who have more differences in terms of how they think and how they perceive the world. So these differences encompass things like communication, information processing, sensory processing, social understanding, and attention. So as I said before, all of our brains are unique. We all do these things in different ways, but for the majority of us, it's similar. Then in the minority, we have people whose communication styles, or whose way of processing information, receiving sensory stimuli, understanding social situations and navigating relationships, and attention can be very, very different. And for those neurodivergent people, it can present with some challenges, but also some incredible strengths. So neurodiversity and the difference in our brain, I believe, is a really, really good thing. It's a really powerful thing. It's something that should be embraced in our societies. But at the moment, because the most of the way that we have built systems, processes, spaces has been developed with neurotypical needs in mind, actually neurodivergent people can experience considerable challenges as a result. So I will use neurodivergent people, or neurodivergent as the term that I will use in this presentation, and that I always use because I prefer it and a lot of the community prefer it. But on terminology, it's really important to understand that people have their preferences. There's no universally accepted language yet, or may it ever be. So one of the most important things to recognize is those difference in preferences. And if you know someone, or you're speaking with someone, interacting with someone that's neurodivergent, it's best to ask them what their preferences are. Now, there's a growing body of evidence that says up to 1 in 5 people are neurodivergent. So this is up to 20% of people. So this isn't a small amount of the population. This is a considerable amount of the population. And that number may change. It may grow. We don't really know exactly what that number looks like. But it's really important to understand that it could be this big, it could be even bigger, because it shows how important it is to consider the needs of these people from the outset when we're doing things like designing spaces and building spaces, because it's not pockets of people. And even if it was, we should really be considering the needs of absolutely everybody, because it's important for us to enable everybody to access communities and environments and opportunities. So what does it feel like to be neurodivergent? If you're not, it's very difficult to have an idea of that. And even if you are, it's very difficult to know what the next person feels like when they're neurodivergent. So what I want to do is I want to do an exercise with you at the moment, which will give you a little bit of a sense of what it can feel like to be neurodivergent. And this exercise simulates, from my perspective, what it's like to have ADHD. So it's not a direct simulation. It's not exactly what it's like. And it certainly won't be what it's like for everybody. But for me, this gives you quite a good indication of one of the ways in which it plays out. So what I want you to do is, in a minute, I want you to read, or say, sorry, the colours that you see. So starting with the one here on the top right and working all the way through in the rows as you would read normally to the one in the bottom left, sorry, top left, bottom right. But what I want you to do is, I don't want you to read the colours. I want you to say the colour that you see. So to make that really clear, the one on the left-hand side here, I don't want you to say blue. I want you to say red. And the one on the right-hand side, I don't want you to say blue. I want you to say black. So I appreciate this is quite difficult for those of you whose English maybe isn't first language, but bear with me on this. It should show you what it's like to be processing information that's coming at you in 2 different ways, when it's quite difficult subconsciously to distinguish from the relevant from the irrelevant information. So what I'm going to do in a minute, I'm going to move on to the next slide, which will have that grid of colours, and I will start a timer. And when I start a timer, I want you to do that reading out loud to yourself or in your head, whatever you find best. And then I want you to look at the time on the timer to see where you got to, and to see how long it took you. Are you ready? So, ready, go. So I expect some of you, the majority of you may have finished here. What we tend to find is that most people get over 10 seconds. So you may have got under 10 seconds. If you did, very, very well done. Most people get over 10 seconds, some people near 20, and some people even beyond that. And what I'm sure you will have found is it's really hard. It's really hard to, you know what you want to do, you understand what you're trying to do, but the information coming into your brain is being very difficult to distinguish between what is actually relevant, so the color that you're seeing, and what is irrelevant, which is the word. And as an ADHDer myself, that's what I feel like I experience. I feel like I can be given lots and lots of information, lots and lots of things to do. And sometimes my brain is working against me in trying to understand what maybe my priorities are or the order in which I need to do those things. And that can definitely play out in spaces if you're met by a lot of sensory stimuli, a lot of information, and maybe it's not exactly clear what you should be focusing on, how you should be using that space, how you should be navigating that space. So I feel like it's a really, really useful exercise to do. But what I want you to do now is I want us to do it again. And this time you should find it a lot easier. So this time you'll see that they're both the same. And I want you to retime yourself again, starting now. So you may still be going, but what we tend to find is that the majority of people then get under 10 seconds, or certainly a lot quicker than they did in the first time, because all of the information coming at you is the same in terms of what it's trying to achieve. So it's much, much easier. And that's what you get as an ADHDer. If everything is set up around to support the way that your brain is working and can be really, really beneficial. So hopefully that gave you a little bit of a flavour of what it can sometimes be like if you're in an environment where you've got a lot of things coming at you and your brain is almost fighting to interpret what all of that is meaning. So the impact of the built environment, what can this do for neurodivergent people? I'm going to show you a quick video which looks at turns things on its head slightly and looks at imagining an office or a workplace that was designed just by autistic people. And I think it's really, really good to understand and flip it on its head to show us the impact that a built environment can have, the impact that a space can have, or just an environment in general can have for neurodivergent people if their needs have been considered from the outset.
Imagine a company made up of only autistic people. When the business was created, they designed it exactly as they wanted it. Their conversations were to the point, lights were dimmed, unnecessary noise reduced, and the office was a calm environment. One day, some non-autistic people joined the company. When they started, they noticed a distinct lack of small talk. They felt they began to stand out from everyone else each time they commented on the weather or the latest sports result. The original staff noticed the non-autistic people insisted on wearing uncomfortable clothing just because it looked nice, and when socialising, chose the busiest and loudest venue possible. Working groups and committees were formed within the business to help integrate the non-autistic people. Several long-term employees became worried about what was known as the problem of the non-autistics. Training courses have suggested to the non-autistics to have a conversation style that is more direct and to the point. Special areas are created for non-autistics to sit in, where it is bright, loud, and busy. But then one day, the non-autistics realised that there wasn't actually anything wrong with them, just that society and the business excluded them.
So there's a little note that comes up here because we like to make it really clear that we used autistic stereotypes for the purpose of that video, but just for illustrative purposes only. So the autistic stereotype is only one way that somebody can be autistic. And as a community, we really need to move away from just thinking about autistic people in that one way. But we wanted to use it just to illustrate this point, and we did get the support of the autistic community with that. Now, that video wasn't just developed with the kind of built environment in mind, but what it shows is the difference it can make for people if everything has been set up with their needs catered for at the beginning. And what that video does, in a hopefully you think quirky way, illustrates something called the social model of disability. So the social model of disability is different to the medical model of disability, which is the much more traditional way of thinking about things. So the medical model of disability says someone is disabled as a result of their about their impairment. So in the case of a wheelchair user, it's easy to think about when you can visualize it. Under the medical model of disability, someone is disabled as a result of their legs not working, or their back being broken, not having legs, whatever their impairment may be. But the social model of disability says that someone is disabled as a result of their environment. So for the case of a wheelchair user, again, they would be disabled under the social model by lack of access. So a lack of lifts, a lack of ramps, a lack of things that enable them to access that space. So it's really important to try to think about things through the lens of the social model of disability, because it puts the onus on society, on other people, on workplaces, on architects, designers, to think about the needs of those people and make sure that they're giving them the opportunity to access spaces in the way that they have every right to. So a space can the way a space is built and designed can either enhance or hinder a neurodivergent person's kind of ability to access the community. And so it's really important to make sure, obviously, that we are thinking about things from the enhancement perspective, and what can we do to make sure that we are supporting neurodivergent people in these spaces, and how are we building them to enhance their experience rather than hinder. So some of the things to consider and to realise as you're thinking about this from a design perspective is the sensory experience. So we all have different sensory preferences, and by sensory preferences I mean things like our senses, so the way that we hear things, see things. We have movement senses, so the way that we're experiencing things as we move around. All of those senses, we all have different needs. Broadly speaking, you can either be somebody who seeks a lot more of that sense, so really needs a lot of sound to be stimulated, a lot of movement to be stimulated, or you go the other way and you might be very, very sensitive and have a very small capacity for some of those senses. So you might be very overwhelmed very easily in noisy spaces or bright environments, things like that. Now, for neurodivergent people, they usually fall at the extreme ends of those spectrums. So you will either find that neurodivergent people, for some of those senses, will be incredibly sensitive and have very, very small capacity for those senses, or completely on the other end and have very, very large capacity for those senses. And it can be different for each sense. So you could be a neurodivergent individual who has very limited capacity in terms of sound, and doesn't really want very much sound. And if you have any more than that, you get very, very overwhelmed. But in the same, in the same person, that person could have a very, very high capacity for movement. So it could be someone that really needs to move, really needs to engage in spaces in that way in order to get their needs met. So sensory processing is a really interesting topic, and is something I care passionately about. I'm going to run a workshop on it, and there is lots and lots that you can do from a sensory perspective to enhance the space for neurodivergent individuals that we'll come onto in a little while. The second thing is around clarity of expectations. So a lot of neurodivergent people seek really, really high levels of detail in terms of what's expected of them. They want to really understand how things are going to play out, what's going to happen. So if you think about that in terms of space, you really want to make sure that you're considering the needs of those people and making it really obvious how to use a space, perhaps where to go in terms of wayfinding and orientation. You want to make it as clear as possible so that there doesn't leave any room for sort of interpretation or ambiguity for the people who have those needs. Then it's really important to think about regulation. So for a lot of neurodivergent people, regulation is so key. So actually you can find that some people are dysregulated in environments quite quickly. So it might be that actually a lot of the spaces that we have dysregulate people because their needs haven't been considered, perhaps because of the sensory experience. But also it's really, really useful to be able to use spaces to support regulation and to support neurodivergent people to regulate better. So on the first side of that, I think a useful example to think about is airports. So I hadn't been on a plane for 5 years until last week, and I went to an airport for the first time, and it really hit me how much of an overwhelming sensory experience it was for me. I have quite low tolerance for things like smells, and that is very difficult to avoid in an airport duty free. Also, it's very bright. Everything is very white. Lots and lots of open space. So I found that experience, and that is echoed by a lot of neurodivergent people, incredibly dysregulating. So there's lots of things that you can do to maybe not have all of that there in the first place. So perhaps not be using so much bright white, or enable people to go somewhere. So go to kind of smaller, quieter spaces if they can. Really, really useful to be able to offer that opportunity for people. But also, you can have spaces that regulate people. So actually there are lots of I know of universities, I know of workplaces that are really starting to look at how they can build spaces within spaces that can support regulating neurodivergent people. So can you create little pods, sensory pods, areas of calm, places where they can shut themselves away, shut out all of the noise, shut out all of the bright lights, maybe put on their own choice of music, things like that, to really enable regulation within a space. And then finally, always remember that all neurodivergent people are unique. So much like all neurotypical people are unique, all neurodivergent people are unique in that same way. So it's really important to not just think these are neurodivergent people's needs, therefore this is what I need to do in every space. Every time I'm designing or building something, this is what I need to do. It will vary, and it's really important to take that into account. So with all of that in mind, what I want to talk through is some neuro-inclusive design principles, and then within that, some examples of what you can do to build spaces and to design spaces that are neuro-inclusive. So the first one is to base everything around the principle of universal design. So what we have at the moment is the majority of society, and this applies beyond just kind of architecture and design. Most people have developed spaces, processes, systems with neurotypical needs in mind. And then what we're doing is we're trying to adjust things or change things or add things on that can support neurodivergent people. What would be far better is if we're taking the needs of those people taking the needs of those people in mind at the beginning. And that's what universal design is about. It's making sure that we're catering for the needs of everybody. So you want to cater for the needs even of those people that may seem to be on the extreme, because then you end up meeting everybody's needs. And I think that's only truly when we get to a place where we can operate as a neuro-inclusive society. But how can we do that? So one of the things I talked about was around the senses and the sensory experience. So thinking about the sensory design is really, really important. And like I said, it can be different for lots of people. So really, really important to think about the different senses we have and the different things that we might be able to do. So for example, if you're thinking about lighting and you're thinking about colour, perhaps think about including adjustable lighting options, so dimmers, so that people can actually change and control the lighting in different areas. So you don't necessarily need to know what the needs of people are, but you want to put those in place so that they can control it. I'd really advise to, where possible, avoid using harsh fluorescent lighting or bright white walls and equipment, because that can be really, really overwhelming for some people. So bright white is very, very difficult for some autistic people, some dyslexic people, people with visual processing disorders, that we don't quite realise the glare can be so overwhelming and dysregulating that it can not just make it a negative experience, but can be incredibly difficult and painful for people. It might be worth thinking about providing areas with sensory lighting. So for those that are seeking out that sensory experience, you might want to put things, if you can, in like bubble tube lamps, reflective balls, LED light strips, mirror balls, different things that can actually provide that great sensory experience. And I think we often think about that when we think about children and their sensory needs, but it really equally applies to adults. And it's brilliant to be able to give that opportunity for people to get that if they need it. Also, consider the placement of light. So you want to consider where it is, how it's going to fall, and whether things like the flooring might act as a reflecting surface, to think about potential sources of glare. Now, that might sound like something that you would want to do anyway, but if you think about it through a neurodivergent lens, it's even more important, because there can be much more subtle lines between this being, okay, and a really difficult source of glare. And some of the other things to think about around sensory, these sensory experiences, you'll have people who really need to move a lot, really need to engage a lot more with the space. And furniture can be a great way of doing that. So a lot of us would think about furniture in terms of quite static furniture, but actually including things, if you can, if you were to put chairs in, you might want to consider things like rocking chairs or wobble chairs, using exercise balls, sofas for those who may be dyspraxic and need something a little bit more comfortable, standing desks in office environments, or just adjustable furniture in general. So some really, really kind of useful things to think about incorporating within space from a sensory perspective. Then wayfinding and orientation. So as I mentioned before, understanding how to navigate a space is so important, to be able to create clear expectations, not get people distracted by all of the sensory things that are happening around them, and make it just very, very clear without any room for interpretation, kind of how to navigate that space. To talk about my airport example, again, I found that very difficult when I entered an airport for the first time. Even though I was very clear what I needed to do, it didn't feel like all the information was coming at me to lead me on that journey, without me getting distracted, go round the wrong way and things like that. Flexibility. So one of the key things I'd love for you to take away from this is to embed flexibility into your designs. So you won't always know exactly what the needs of every neurodivergent person is, but if you put flexibility in there, it can support multiple people. So I mentioned obviously before about having, lighting fixtures that you can kind of change, but you also might want to create different zones or, spaces within spaces, sensory pods, small breakout areas, so that people can get what they need from a space. So if they're finding it overwhelming, maybe they can go to a smaller space that you've created in a larger one. If they don't like an open plan environment, there might be somewhere that's a little bit more closed off that they can go to. Lots and lots of things that you can do to input flexibility into your designs and make sure that people can access what they need. And then finally, inclusivity. So one of the best things that you can do is to talk to neurodivergent people in the design process and to make sure that their needs are being understood at the beginning. You won't be able to cater for everybody's needs. I always say that 100% neuro inclusion is almost impossible because some of our needs are contradictory. But what's really important is to talk to people, understand the needs, test things, put things into place, share designs, get them to feed back and share their own ideas. Because that way you are really, really getting into the minds of the people that are going to be using those spaces, and not just those that will see everything through a neurotypical lens. So hopefully that's helpful. I'd be really happy to take some questions if you have any, and also in advance, afterwards, if you have a chance to reflect and you have any questions, you're very, very welcome to reach out to me. But I'm really hoping that has been helpful in terms of taking you forward into thinking about neurodiversity in your designs.
Thank you, Jessica. This is a really, really interesting presentation. I think it really helps to understand, embrace, and benefit from neurodiversity. So we still have a couple of minutes to answer the questions. Feel free to send those in the chat. We have received already some. Let me read out loud. So in what ways might a neurodiversity-informed design approach differ from traditional design methodologies?
Yes, I think kind of continuing what I said before, broadly, I think much like, and this just isn't just design methodologies, this is our whole society. We're just very used to a neurotypical way of thinking. So a neuro-inclusive way of thinking and embracing neurodiversity just means taking into account the needs of the what could be termed the extreme, but I don't think it's the extreme. So really thinking about all of those different things. And I think things like the sensory experience, I think, is a really, really big one. It is huge, and making sure that you have thought about all of the different ways. I use an analogy for sensory processing with cups. So I say that internally, if you imagine that every person has a cup, a metaphorical cup for their each sense. And our cups are different sizes. So if you have a small cup, it means that it gets filled up really, really quickly. And you might have a small cup for sound, but a really, really big cup for lighting or what you see. So understanding that is really important, and you want to make sure that you're taking those kind of things into account, as opposed to assuming that we all have the same level of needs from a sensory perspective. And then when you start to understand that, there's lots of things that you can do that might be different from more traditional design methodologies, which maybe cater for the more standard sensory experience, and start to put things in. So, you might want to think more differently about textures, about colors, and how you use that space to satisfy both ends of the spectrum.
Okay, great, thanks. More questions are coming in. It's what does regulating mean exactly?
Very good question. So regulation is when you feel regulated, you feel a lot of people talk about being in the green zone. So you kind of feel good, you feel settled, you feel comfortable. You're not having to worry about what your emotions so much or what's going on around you, because you're ready to, maybe if you're in a learning environment, you're ready to learn, or if you're at work, you're ready to work. You just feel good. If you feel dysregulated, it can mean that your nervous system is operating at a slightly heightened level. So you might be feeling a bit stressed. Things can feel a bit unbalanced to you in your mind and also in your body. And so making sure that you are regulated, or that your other people are supporting you to be regulated, is really important. So to give an example, because I know that can feel a little bit abstract, we have two movement senses, proprioception and vestibular input. And if you have a high level of those senses that you need, and you're not getting them, you can feel dysregulated. And I once worked with an OT who explained it to me by saying, if you imagine you're sitting on an exercise ball, on a yoga ball, and you're just sitting there and you're trying to do some work. Now imagine you lift your feet off the ground and you're wobbling around. That can be what it's like if you're feeling dysregulated from a movement perspective. Okay. And so then that can be really, really difficult to then do all of the other things that you're doing. It can lead to real dysregulation. And we talk a lot, you may have heard the term meltdown when it relates to neurodivergent people. Other people like to term it nervous system overload, because that's really what it's like. Your nervous system is getting overloaded and you can't cope anymore.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. You made it really, really clear. There are some questions coming in with regards to educational environments. So let me see if I can put the question in one. It's mainly, is there a difference in designing for neurodiverse students versus work offices, and what adjustments can be made to enhance the learning experience for neurodivergent students?
Lots in that. So
yes.
My personal view actually is that there doesn't really need to be the distinction between what children and adults need. I think as a society, we've kind of made it different. We feel like adults should cope with more than children can. And yes, to a certain degree, but neurodivergent adults have needs, much like neurotypical adults have needs. And I think we should really recognize that. So a lot of the things that work for neurodivergent people will cover children and adults. In terms of what you can do in the education environment, I think if you take into account the needs of neurodivergent people, you often meet the needs of neurotypical people as a byproduct, because you're catering for slightly, in some people's eyes, more extreme needs. And so therefore, you're kind of covering off those more typical needs. And in a school environment, if you're doing that, you want to be thinking about things like, much like I've talked about, creating separate spaces, even if it's within the same room that children can go to if they need some time away from maybe the other children, maybe the overload of noise, or somewhere where they can go. Maybe they get the tactile input they want. I was speaking to someone just yesterday that said, their child has an area in the school, in the classroom, that's got lots of really soft cushions, soft fabrics. They have fabrics on the wall, and that can be very, very regulating for them. Other things in schools to think about are standing desks, actually, much like you might think about in office spaces, because actually a lot of us learn and work much better if we're standing, if we're moving. Our society has developed into a society that is very still, very static. We think sitting is what we should be doing, but that is not how we were born. That is not how we originated. Actually, it's much better for us to be moving and doing things like that. So just some examples. I have a lot of examples about education, but hopefully that's just a few.
Yeah, very interesting. Thanks. Now, going back to office spaces, we get a question here. Should we change our landscape offices back to more personal spaces? And has COVID created homework as beneficiary for the neurodivergent?
Yeah, great. Two really interesting questions. So
yes,
the first one, I don't think we should change it. I think we should have both options available. So kind of open spaces, open working environments can actually be quite good for some people. But what you want to do is take into account the needs of people who may need some space to go, some other space to go. So maybe an office, a small office that they can go to, or a pod, something like that. But also, I think we can make open plan offices more accessible for neurodivergent people by making sure we're thinking about the corridors and how that flows, thinking about the colours that we use, thinking about the lighting, thinking about lots of different ways in which actually, even if you are in an open office space, is there the opportunity? So talking around the houses, but a lot of neurodivergent people find it very difficult in open office space where people can be watching them and they don't know they are. And that can be quite overwhelming and difficult and dysregulating. Whereas if you can make sure that you've got some desks that are sitting maybe towards the outside and around the edges, where you're always very aware of who's looking at you and you don't feel like there are people all around you, that can be really good. Not putting things like desks near like the kitchen space, corridors, toilet areas, all of those kind of things can really help. So I would definitely say it's not an either or, but making sure we're accommodating for both. And the second thing around home working, it's not a black and white answer. For some neurodivergent people, yes, absolutely. It's hugely beneficial to work from home, both in terms of setting up the space that works for them and not being overwhelmed by the office environment, but also things like the commute to work can be very, very difficult, very dysregulating for neurodivergent people. So home working is a brilliant, brilliant thing to have happened. Having said that, some neurodivergent people love the structure and the routine of going to the office. Some people thrive on social interaction and being in a space with other people. So it's not a one size fits all thing at all. And having both options available, I think, is so important. And that is what has been a really, really good thing to have come from COVID.
Yeah, the flexibility.
Exactly.
Yes. Okay, great. We still have a few questions, but we will answer those afterwards. And publish everything via the email, including also the recording that you will receive after this webinar. So it has come to an end. Thank you again, Jess, for these very interesting insights. And thank you all of you to be with us, and we hope to see you again for the next webinar on neuro-inclusive design. Okay.
Thank you for having me,
bye.
Sophie.
Bye.